Born on the 2nd of October 1452 in Fotheringhay, Northamptonshire, Richard Plantagenet, described by the historian Charles Ross as no more than a junior cadet of a great aristocratic family, would rise to become Duke of Gloucester and the major power in the north of England in the 1470s. He would then become king and reign England for 2 tumultuous years from June 1483 to August the 22nd, 1485, when he became the last English king to die in battle at the age of 32. More than 500 years on, his life and short reign remain among the most controversial and contested in English history, and probably British history too. At the heart of his story is Richard himself, and our aim in this special episode of the Ricardian Podcast is to focus on the man and what we know of him. Who was he? What did he really want to achieve? And why did it all go wrong? Joining me to explore the life of Richard III is Matt Lewis, the historian and presenter of the History Hit podcast and author of several books, including his important biography of the last Plantagenet king, Richard III, Loyalty Binds Me. Also joining us is the writer Annie Garthwaite, author of the best-selling and critically acclaimed historical novels Cecily and the King's Mother, inspired by the life of Richard III's own mother, Cecily Neville. And finally, we're joined by Kenneth Hillier, a retired schoolmaster and long-standing member of the Richard III Society's Research Committee, who has been reading and writing about Richard III for more than 50 years. Welcome to you all. Should we just check the microphones are working?
Hello, Alec. Thank you very much for having us.
Okay, well, let us start at the beginning. Matt Lewis, please, could you set the scene for Richard's birth and his upbringing up to maybe the age of 9 or 10, no small task. Who were his parents? What was the world he was born into? And what were his expectations, please?
Yeah, so Richard is the youngest child who will survive infancy of Richard, 3rd Duke of York, and Cecily Neville, the Duchess of York. Richard, 3rd Duke of York, is, at the time of Richard's birth, considered by many to be the heir to the throne to the childless King Henry VI. He is perhaps the most significant royal nobleman in the country, incredibly powerful, not just because he's Duke of York, but because he's acquired the inheritance also of the Mortimer family, who arguably have an even better claim to the throne, but who also definitely have lots and lots of land and lots and money. So it's the Mortimer inheritance really that makes York rich and able to live the lifestyle that he lives. And so Richard is the 4th son, and so as a 4th son of a duke who may or may not inherit the throne one day, Richard probably wasn't expected to amount to very much in his life. He may have been destined for the church, something like that. Younger sons of noble families with spares may have ended up trying to find their own way in the world in that kind of a way. But his life is very much so. He's born in 1452, right on the cusp of when we generally talk about the Wars of the Roses beginning in 1455. So he's born into a country that is spiralling into problems. 1452 is the same year that his father takes an army to Dartford to try and kind of impose himself on the government of Henry VI, and York is effectively arrested there and forced to swear never to raise arms against Henry VI ever again. So Richard is born into this kind of superheated environment that is getting hotter and hotter and hotter, and moving from a kind of Cold War into a much hotter war. And his life up until the age of kind of 8 or 9 is very much the story of being thrown around on the changing fortunes of the Wars of the Roses. I imagine he was quite sheltered from all of this for the first few years of his life. He's brought up at Fotheringhay Castle in the nursery, significantly I think with his older brother George and older sister Margaret. So they're the 3 youngest surviving children of the York family, and I think this is an important part of Richard's story that we often miss, just how close he probably was to Margaret, and particularly to George. When we think of the problems George will cause later, theirs is a really interesting relationship, I think. And Richard kind of erupts onto the political scene, if you like, or begins to appear in records at the age of just 7 in 1459, when his father raises a force again at Ludlow, so this thing that he's promised in 1452 he would never do again. He's fought the first Battle of St Albans against Henry VI's forces in 1455, and now he's raising an army again in 1459. And the family are moved to Ludlow on the Welsh Marches, which is the Mortimer power base, the Mortimer stronghold. And clearly York is now feeling like Fotheringhay isn't somewhere that he wants to leave his family, that it's not secure enough. York marches out of Ludlow, but ends up returning a few days later, being essentially pursued by a huge royal army. In the middle of the night, so Richard, his passes his 7th birthday as all of these preparations are taking place, and about 10 days after his 7th birthday, this royal army is camped outside Ludlow. York, part of that army, the Yorkist army, defects back to the royal camp, and the Yorkist leaders, so York, his 2 oldest sons, Edward and Edmund, York's brother-in-law, Richard Neville, the Earl of Salisbury, Cecily Neville's brother, and Salisbury's son, the Earl of Warwick, the famous kingmaker Earl of Warwick, all make this decision to essentially run away, to flee, to live to fight another day. But they leave behind Cecily and George and Margaret and the 7-year-old Richard in Ludlow. And we're told in several of the sources that Ludlow is sacked by the Lancastrian army, that they're robbing everywhere to the bare walls, including the castle, and that they are rampaging through the town. One of the sources says wet shod in wine, it's this image of them drunkenly debauching themselves in Ludlow. And Richard is witness to all of these threats, this fear that he must have felt, I think. He's gone from watching the exciting arrival of all of these men coming out for his father, watching his big brothers practicing their military prowess in the grounds of Ludlow Castle, to suddenly seeing it abandoned, filled with enemy soldiers, and maybe not quite knowing what this meant for him. And he'll then spend a period in custody of his aunt, his mother's sister, at which point Cecily seems to be negotiating with Parliament to try to keep the door ajar for her husband, to try and secure pardons for everybody, to secure an income for her and her children, because the family are deprived of everything that they have. So again, he's at this point seeing his mother working incredibly hard to protect her youngest children, but not quite sure what's happening. And then we lurch from there to his dad coming back and claiming the throne, comes back from Ireland, claims Henry VI's crown. We get the Act of Accord put in place, which is this kind of compromise that suits nobody. Henry VI will remain king for the rest of his life, and York will succeed him. And eventually then York will be killed before the end of that year, before the end of 1460. York and his second son Edmund die at Wakefield. And then Richard is put in a boat by his mum Cecily, him and his brother George and a couple of servants put in a boat and sent over to the Low Countries, effectively into exile, because it seems like the conflict has reached the point now where in 1459, if everyone was happy that women and children weren't going to be harmed, by early 1461 that certainty is gone, and Cecily is so frightened that she's putting her small children in a boat and having them rowed overseas. And then Richard will spend 6 months or so in uncertainty and exile and isolation over there, not knowing what's going on at home, until his brother eventually becomes King Edward IV and summons him back. And I mean, all of this is happening to a boy who's under 10 years old.
And I mean, there's an awful lot to happen in the first sort of 9 or 8 years of your life. Okay, Annie, you've written a lot about Richard III's mother and him and the rest of the York family, based on the research you've done, but also the active kind of psychological transference you've done. What's your sense of the man that's emerging from this, and what's he like and what's he want?
I think the picture that Matt paints in all of that is really powerful, and the thing that strikes me, just listening to him telling that tale, is that one of Richard's earliest memories will have been the sacking of Ludlow, his own imprisonment with his aunt and so on. And he will have seen the power of his mother working. One of his earliest memories will have been of an politically active, engaged mother fighting tooth and nail to keep her family together and to save her family. And I do find myself wondering what an incredibly strong influence that must have had. Because he wasn't with his father, he wasn't with his brothers, he was with his mother and seeing her operate. And I wonder how that might have affected his relationship with other women later in life, and what he might have then looked for in a wife.
And it's your sense of Richard, because you've recreated him in fiction, but is he an introvert? Is he an extrovert? Is he thoughtful? He's said to be pious. What do you think he was like as a person?
I think my impression of him, you have to remember too that, as Matt said, he is the youngest brother. He's kind of the afterthought. He is the spare of the spare of the spare.
Yeah.
He wasn't expected to do great things. He wasn't the next in line to the Dukedom of York. He was the fourth son, and nice to have. And my sense of him was he was a guy who kept his head down, got on with it, learned from an early age to keep his head down and get on with it, but to watch and always be alert for danger and risk. Because my word, he was introduced to danger and risk very early. So I think that those early experiences would give us a man who was thoughtful, reflective, but always looking over his shoulder to see what was coming at him next.
Ken, you've been reading and thinking about Richard for a very long time. What's your sense of what the evidence tells us, what the man was like himself?
Well, can I start by praising Annie's The King's Mother, which I read in the last few weeks, and addressing why I thought it was such a satisfying novel, apart from its obvious research qualities, came down to the coherence and the plausibility of its characters. And if you look, for instance, at the ruthless, steadfast, I think, myopia of Margaret Beaufort in the book, Elizabeth Woodville's what I'd call parvenu paranoia, the matriarch, Cecily, I think she'd have fitted in. If you ever watch Peaky Blinders, the very first episode years back, I think she'd have fitted in there rather well. And then, of course, Richard. I think Annie hits it on the right spot right at the beginning, and I'm quoting now. We first meet Richard. He smiles his wry chess-playing smile. I think that's lovely. And that's absolutely the image that, in a way, we take through the book. We follow him on and off stage until Bosworth. And by the end, we have a believable Richard. But there's a huge but, isn't there? Matt, recalling one of your predecessors, Jeremy Potter, who was in charge when I first joined as chairman of the Richard III Society, he wrote, "History is not made by great men and women, nor by social and economic forces. It is made by historians, a play of the imagination upon the known facts." And of course Voltaire, you all know the Voltaire quote, "History is a pack of tricks that we play upon the dead." Now, I don't want to accuse Annie of playing tricks, obviously, but over a novel, Richard evolves, and it's a unit which makes sense. Now, my Richard is very similar to Matt's and to Annie's, and I think both of them has hit it on the head. I mean, you imagine yourself at 10, having gone through, particularly after about 5, obviously your earliest memories are not particularly important, but from 5 to 10, and if we link up with what Matt has said, and then add to it Annie's point about the mother and the lack of brothers and fathers about, and we haven't come on yet to the problems which will ensue, I think it must have been bewildering. That's one word I've used. And also exciting. I mean, again, this is imagination. When I used to teach history, I used to say imagination was the first thing that's important as a historian. And if you can imagine that wonderful, this is where I first read about Matt's books, how his love for Ludlow. I too have love for Ludlow. And imagine yourself on the ramparts. We can't quite do that these days. A little boy of 8, 9, 10 and so on. Ludford's just happened. You're being surrounded by the enemy. I mean, it's exciting, but it's also bewildering and frightening. And here's Mum to help out. Always remember they're individuals, they're human beings. That's how I start my history.
Thank you very much, Ken. Let's look at the 1460s then. So his brother's become king, his father's died, been killed. He's been at the scarring episodes at Ludlow, and he's been shipped off the Low Countries and he's back. And he's made, in October of 1460, he's made Duke of Gloucester, and suddenly he's growing up. But he's still got a fair amount of growing up to do, Matt. So tell us, just fill us in quickly on what happens to him in the 1460s.
Yeah, so I think it used to be believed that he spent most of the 1460s in the household of his cousin, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, the famous kingmaker. I think now we know he spent much less time in Warwick's household than was originally believed. And we get this episode after Edward IV first becomes king, so he's crowned in 1461. When Richard and George in particular come back to London and Edward is made king, we get lots of sources talking about how Edward is visiting his little brothers, almost on a daily basis, and he's the one providing for them, for making sure they have everything that they need. So I think for Richard, the first bit of security that he feels in a very long time is centred on Edward. And Edward becomes something of a father figure to him, someone who is providing for him, who is giving him not just a dukedom, but that sense of personal security, of being safe from the shifting sands that have moved around underneath him for the last few years of his life. And he moves around a little bit, and he's partly in the household of the Archbishop of Canterbury for a while. He's actually in the household of Thomas Stanley for a short while too, which is an interesting relationship to think about later in both of their lives. But then he does at some point in the mid 1460s make his way up to Middleham, to Yorkshire, and to the household of Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick. And this is a huge moment for Richard. So he's sent there, as many young noble boys are, to learn how to be a nobleman. This is his training for how he's going to behave when he's older. And I think it's really important to think about who Warwick is at this point, because this is the influence he's going to have on young Richard. Warwick is perhaps the most famous nobleman in all of England at this point. He is, there probably isn't a bigger celebrity than Warwick in England. He's a famous soldier. His military reputation isn't necessarily the best, but nevertheless, he's considered by most people to be a great soldier. He's a pirate. He's operated as a pirate in the Channel. He's a great sailor. The people of the Low Countries are terrified of Warwick's reputation as a sailor. And he, there are accounts that talk about his house in London when he throws a party, that people are allowed to turn up and you can walk away with as much meat as you can carry away on your knife. So he is this epitome of largesse, of exactly what it should look like to be a really powerful, significant nobleman. He knows how to pull all of those levers of power. He's a master propagandist, and he's made himself incredibly famous and incredibly popular. And this is the guy from whom Richard is going to learn how he needs to behave when he's older. So I imagine going into Warwick's household in the north of England to be a dazzling experience for Richard, a huge opportunity to learn from the best in the game. This is like getting an apprenticeship at a Premier League football club to learn how to be a footballer. He has an incredible opportunity to learn, and it's also quite dazzling and quite daunting. This is probably the most famous man in England apart from the king, and he's going to teach you everything you need to know.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And is this the point, Annie, when Richard meets his future wife, Anne Neville, daughter of the Earl of Warwick, or does it actually happen later?
There's a lot made of this, I think, this sort of idea of an early romantic relationship between Richard and Anne during Richard's time in Middleham and in the north. But I don't quite buy that. The age difference between the two of them is it's a big difference at that point in their lives. I think he would have been aware of her. I'm sure she would have been shown to him. They may have spent time together. But I'm not convinced by this idea that a great passion began there. And also, I think Richard probably had other things on his mind then, and other figures filling his vision. You listen to the way Matt describes the Earl of Warwick. Can you imagine what it would have been like to be in a room with Warwick and Edward IV? These two incredibly larger-than-life characters, and just physically huge and psychologically huge and dramatic and impactful, and your little Richard IV's son looking up at these guys and trying to navigate and find where your position in that is all going to be. And there's no way you're going to compete. So you have to find a different way to be a nobleman in England. I think that is probably what was filling Richard's mind at the time. And we also have to think that it was probably during this period that he began, even if nobody else was at the time, he was probably beginning to be aware of his own physical difficulties with the scoliosis. And I wonder how much that would have affected him in those days too.
Since you've arrived at the topic of the scoliosis, I think we should address it now, because obviously when Richard's remains were uncovered in 2012 in Leicester, it was proven that he was suffering from scoliosis. It definitely had a twist in the spine, which would have had certain effects on him. Matt, can I ask you first, what do we know of what can we know about how this may or may not have limited him in any way, or what impact it would have had upon him?
It's really difficult because nobody talks about this during Richard's lifetime. We get John Rouse mention that he had one shoulder slightly higher than the other kind of a year after the Battle of Bosworth, after his death. So this is clearly something that Richard has kept secret. So he must have wanted to keep it secret. He doesn't broadcast it at any point. We know it begins to emerge as a teenager, quite possibly while he's in Warwick's household. We don't know how that maybe affected the dynamic between him and Warwick. I think in a pious medieval world that Richard grew up in, we have to wonder about what he thought that meant for him. If there is a belief that outward signs of disability point to a corrupted soul, which is something that parts of the medieval world believed at various times. Not everybody believed that, but some people did. Does that mean that Richard has this view of himself as what have I done to deserve this? Am I more corrupt than other people? Do I need to work extra hard to become a good Christian person? And can we see that impacting the level of piety that we see later in his life? Can we see it developing a degree of empathy in his character for those who are struggling in the world more generally? We see him being very, very concerned with those lower down the social scale, the more ordinary people. Is that a symbol of the kind of the empathy that is driven from his own struggles with the way that the world will view him and the way that he feels he has to work harder to do what everybody else might have to do? But having said that, we know he takes part in 2 battles in 1471 at Barnet and Tewkesbury, and he acquits himself incredibly well. He is given lead of the vanguard in the second battle as a result of his performance in the first. There is a Yorkist poem that is written after the 2 battles in which he is compared to Hector, the greatest warrior in all of Troy, and he's the only one amongst people like Edward IV and all of these other figures. Richard is the only one who is compared to a Greek hero. So there is something about the way that he has acquitted himself in those battles that makes him stand out to his peers. And we know, he doesn't have a big military career between there and Bosworth in 1485, but we know he puts on a suit of armour and he rides into battle and he fights at Bosworth, and he is described in the sources as fighting manfully in the thickest... spoiler, sorry.
Okay, so I think we can say that it's a fact of life, but it's a privately held fact, his scoliosis, and evidently does not restrict him physically to any great degree.
I think it's worth saying, Usain Bolt has scoliosis. We're not talking about something that necessarily restricts everybody's ability to do anything. There are lots of people who aren't affected by scoliosis at all.
And there's also the idea of, Richard's piety and how, from a religious sense, he might have thought about the problem. But he's also, he's a chess player. He's got a fine legal mind. He's a very rational man, I think. So I think he'd be figuring this out, how to deal with this, what it meant for him, what it implied for him, from both a religious point of view, but also a purely rational point of view. And I think that's an aspect of Richard's character that is there throughout, really. I felt very strongly that there is a strong religiosity, but there is a strong humanism, there is a strong rational mind there at play.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Now, on the way into scoliosis, we were talking about Richard being in the Earl of Warwick's household, and of course it is to the Earl of Warwick return for the next great turning point in Richard's life, which is the Earl of Warwick becoming dissatisfied with the rule of Edward IV and his decision to throw his lot in again with Henry VI, and we have suddenly Edward IV is deposed, and Henry VI is readapted, brought back and made king again for 6 weeks or whatever it is. Edward and Richard obviously go to the Low Countries, and then they come back, and we have some of these famous battles. We've got Towton and Barnet. Barnet in April 1471, when of course Richard is in battle for the first time, we're told, and Matt, you've just said, he equips himself well and is then compared with Hector, the great Greek hero. At this point, he then emerges as something of a martial individual. So he's fulfilling the promise of all those years of the apprenticeship he's been serving at Fotheringhay. Ken, let's turn to you because I know that you share the same thoughts, because we discussed them earlier, about the religious dimension of scoliosis on Richard and his awareness of, the way that society at the time would judge him for it. But then at the same time, we now have him in 1471 demonstrating his prowess militarily and being lauded for it. Do you have a sense of how that experience shaped Richard?
Yes, at the danger of being a little bit of an echo chamber, if I can pick up a bit of what both of them said. I mean, Annie's point about looking up, I mean, it was physically looking up, wasn't it, to Edward in particular. I don't know what Warwick's height was, but you've got this dichotomy almost in Richard, for Richard, of the heroes literally in front of him on different occasions. Warwick, Matt's quite right, in Warwick and Edward. And at the same time, the point about scoliosis, we don't know how fast it went. So what might have been a minor issue when he was 13, 14, we don't even know when it really started. We're guessing it's 13, 14. There may have been little change for the next 4 or 5 years. We don't know. But it is a dichotomy of this problem that you have a physical impairment which is changing, which is increasing either slowly or speedily. And then these heroes. And then you've got this problem again of one of the heroes with a feet of clay, Warwick. And here we have a problem. We're talking about a teenager, talking about a young teenager who idolises his eldest brother. We can talk about what he thinks about Clarence another time. But he idolises his brother. He has idolised Warwick, I'm sure he did. Growing up, however long he was in Midland is a slight red herring. Warwick was an ever-present importance in his life. And then you get to the 1470s, here's a boy, still a boy, who is probably by now in pain, who is hiding this, and the psychology of it, you come on to the piety now, and I'm sure that all of you've read Anne Sutton's and Livia's books on religious books, but also on his piety. And they summarise by saying, actually, you can push as many books in front of you, and Richard's signature as well, but it doesn't actually contribute to his personality at all. The fact that he has these books and so on, everything depends on the interpreter's prejudice. And is it sorrow? Is it grief? What is it? We're on dangerous territory here. It's not a science, it's an interpretive art almost. I happen to believe that he was pious. But equally I could talk to somebody else who said, no, this was cynical, this was nonsense, and it was doing because he had a sense of guilt. The problem for Richard, for all of us, is that even from a lot of Ricardians, where do they come into Richard? They come in at the end of his life. And his life is looked at backwards. And what Annie's books and Matt's biographies and so on do is they start at the beginning, which is what we're doing now. And this piety business, I think, grows during the 1460s and 70s. We don't go to 1483-85 and talk about this chivalric charge in Bosworth. No, you go back at the beginning and you look through, and then you can start commenting on Bosworth and others.
Okay, so you think that the chivalry gives way to greater piety, and perhaps that that's a rising influence in his life as he gets older.
But I mean, if I can jump a few years, they actually camp at Agincourt, don't they, in 1475? I mean, what on earth would they be talking about at Agincourt? Surely a previous Duke of Gloucester fights there, a Duke of York loses his life there, a Duke of Clarence goes home early. It's bound to affect him, and this chivalric code, I think, did play a large part in his life.
Since we've moved on to 1475 and the French invasion, I wanted to ask you, Ken, to dilate on that topic, because for you, Richard's decision to kind of reject the Treaty of Picquigny between Edward IV and Louis XI is indicative of his personality, and perhaps you can talk about that, because I think that's an interesting point.
Well, yes, I do. I mean, if you look at Barnard's book, he tells you who went to the 1475 expedition. Richard with Clarence, actually, they provide the most archers, the most chevaliers and so on. Here is somebody who's up for the fight. He's proved himself at Barnet and Tewkesbury. and he's learned about previous episodes, and above all, I was to go back to Agincourt. Here is a wonderful chance to lead an expedition. No wonder he refuses to accept, unlike dear old Hastings, who not only accepts the money but says, "Be quiet about it, please." But Richard doesn't do that, and that's where I start to admire him in a way, in 1475.
Because he rejects the treaty and doesn't take the bribe from Louis XI, unlike his brother, who gets 10,000 livres a year or something.
Yeah.
Okay, so that gives us a moral position. It shows him having a moral position. Matt, do you buy into that interpretation?
I absolutely do, and I think the interesting thing. So I think Richard recognises this as a huge opportunity for the Yorkist kingship to make a statement on the international stage.
Yeah.
I think he also is realistic enough to recognise that Edward has raised an awful lot of money from the country on the basis that he's going to go to war. And if you think about the early 100 Years' War under Edward III and then Agincourt under Henry V, English people get rich from successful war in France. So the taxation is an investment in all of that. And what Edward settles on at Picquigny is essentially he is personally bought off, and a few of his cronies are bought off by Louis. They go home very rich, thank you very much indeed. But someone's got to explain to all those people who've paid tax money for this campaign why there is no glory, there is no booty, there is no opportunity coming for that investment, because they are not getting their tax money back. I think one of the interesting things it shows us, which is something that crops up several times in Richard's life, he is so often positioned as this utterly loyal figure to Edward throughout Edward's reign, who sort of turns on him after 1483. But we have several instances when he is willing to stand up to his brother and say, "I think you've got this wrong." Picquigny is one of those. We see it happen again in relation to the Harringtons at Hornby Castle, where Edward has sided with the Stanley family, Richard sides with the Harringtons against Edward. So he's not incapable of offering what I would position and what I imagine him positioning as this kind of loyal opposition. No, you've got that wrong. You're not doing it the right way. So he's not afraid to stand up to his brother and to make a point when he thinks his brother is wrong. So I think Picquigny is a really important moment in looking at Richard's character.
Brilliant. And when we're considering that Richard is 5'8", his brother's 6'4", and king, you can imagine the physicality there. Two people shouting at each other, thumping their fists around the long table in Windsor or wherever they are. Okay, there's a lot to go through. We've got to consider briefly the marriage, because, in 1472, at some point, Richard does get married to Anne Neville. We don't know when the romance began, but we know it happened, and we know that it's going to have a transformative effect on his position in the country, as well as his brother's kingship and the fact that he is a loyal lieutenant of his brother. So, Annie, we've not heard of you for a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit about the marriage and how it changes Richard's status and position?
Yeah. Well, I think we find ourselves at this point, don't we, where he is, as Matt said, very much loyal to his brother. His brother has been the source of his security personally and dynastically, but he's very aware of his brother's failings, and he is at that point in his life where he is understanding that he needs to build some stability and security of his own and get some control over his own life. And I think Anne is in a very similar position in a way. She is recently widowed, of course, but she has lost her father. She has lost her dynastic position. There is this inheritance that she sees should be hers and is slipping away from her. And she needs a strong man who can stand up to the king and stand up to the Duke of Clarence and keep her in the game. And he needs someone, he needs what Anne can give him in terms of a position in the north that he can build upon. So there are all kinds of political and dynastic reasons why they would look at each other and think, oh yeah, good match. It makes so much sense. So at what point all of that becomes a love affair who knows? And as a novelist, I retain the right to speculate.
But you believe that they had a proper loving marriage.
I do, but I think it was a relationship born out of pragmatism. And I wonder very much how Richard's relationship with Anne was influenced by his mother's relationship with his father. Because Richard, Duke of York, and Cecily Neville, it wasn't a romance, it was a political marriage made when they were very young, as was the case with most noble families. But my God, that was a rock-solid partnership, wasn't it? Of two individuals who stuck together and held it together through absolute thick and thin. And we know that Cecily was very much a player, that she was active in that partnership and active in that relationship, and that Richard, Duke of York, trusted her, relied on her, looked at her as a counsellor and arbiter in things. Kind of wouldn't Richard be looking for that in his own marriage? And it always massively frustrates me that Anne Neville is such a difficult character to get a handle on. There's so little that we know about her, really, or that we can patch together. And in so many ways, I felt when I was writing the book, the only way for me to be able to try and get a handle on what Anne might have been like would be to have imagined what Richard might have been looking for in a wife. And I think he might have been looking for a woman like his mother.
Well, very sensible too. Now, come on, Matt, let's go to you. What in financial terms or in land terms comes to Richard because of this marriage, and how is he set up? What's his position, by the the late 1470s?
I mean, what comes to him is essentially most of the northeast of England. A huge chunk of land, a huge patrimony. I agree with what Annie says about the marriage. Talking about the romance is kind of a little bit of a red herring, because what we can say is this is an incredibly successful political union between the two families. So Anne gives Richard, so the reason that we're told Richard and George, who are married to Warwick's two daughters by this point, don't want Warwick attainted as a traitor, is because then the land goes into the king's hands and he can grant it to them, but then he could take it away as well. So they don't want Warwick attainted, they want to acquire it by the laws of inheritance. And this, I think, is where we see Richard and George, as Annie was saying, trying to kind of insulate themselves from Edward a little bit and from his failings, so that if they've inherited this land, it's theirs. So it is Richard trying to build something for himself independently of his brother, and Anne helps him to do that. And this essentially leaves him, the north of England throughout the medieval period. It's far enough from London that it's almost, the royal writ doesn't really run particularly well there. And it can be a bit of a battleground. The Neville family that Warwick belongs to have long been feuding with the Percy families, the Earls of Northumberland. You get these local tensions that it's really hard for a king in London to sort out. So any king would see it as an absolute godsend to have someone they can trust and who is capable and competent to run the north for them. So when Richard gets this inheritance and is placed in, centred around Middleham Castle, but Baynard Castle, Sheriff Hut, and all of those places around there, and he becomes intricately involved in the life of York, the most significant city in the north of England at this point. Edward has found the golden goose. He's found someone who can run the north of England for him, who he completely and utterly trusts, who isn't playing dynastic games amongst feuding families, who can unify all of those things. And one of the most interesting things that we see is the amount of Warwick's Neville retainers who smoothly transition into Richard's service because of his marriage to Anne, because he's willing to position himself as the new kind of Neville Lord of the North, the new figure there of continuity and reliability. So he's serving the local populace, but he's also serving his brother the king, and in that he's doing a job that very few people in medieval England have managed to do.
Brilliant, thank you. So come the end of the 1470s, he is Lord of the North, and then in the early 1480s we see him leading Edward IV's invasion of Scotland, and leading with great acumen there. So all is going well, and then in April 1483, on the 9th of April in fact, Edward IV drops dead at the age of 40, having been hale and hearty up until this point, and his son Edward, who is 12, is proclaimed king, Edward V. Matt, Could you explain, with economy, how we go from the proclamation of Edward V on presumably the 9th of April 1483 to Richard becoming king in June, just a few short months later?
No. I can give it a go.
It seems to compress kind of the historiography and what is the simplest version of how that
and this is where it all becomes very contested and very subjective, and everyone has their own opinion on what happens next. Essentially, what happens in legal terms is that Edward V is proclaimed king on the death of his father. That's why he gets the regnal number. That's why he's King Edward V. He is based in Ludlow on the Welsh marches, so he's making his way back to London. His mother's family seem to intend to have him crowned really quickly to bypass any need for any kind of a protectorate or anything like that, and this would be about keeping the Woodville family of his mother close to the centre of power. They're wary of being ejected, I think, from that position of power. We've got people like Lord Hastings, essentially Edward IV's best mate. He hates the Woodvilles, so he's fearful of Woodvilles continuing in power. And I think at this point, Richard, who is still in the north of England, is kind of seen as the solution to the problem, to these two squabbling factions in London. And Edward IV, we're told, in a late codicil to his will, which doesn't survive, so we're relying on the fact that sources tell us this existed, has appointed Richard as protector in his son's minority. And protector essentially means that Richard is in charge of the security of England, so internal and external national security. It doesn't mean he's in charge of the new king. It doesn't mean he's single-handedly ruling government in a regency style or anything like that. That's not what protector means in medieval England. But Richard comes south. He meets up with his nephew along the way at Stony Stratford. There seems to be some tension, some confusion there about where they were supposed to meet and what's happening and what the Woodvilles might be up to, so that Edward V is travelling with his Woodville uncle, Earl Rivers, Anthony Woodville, and Richard has Anthony arrested. He seems to be suspicious enough that something is going on to have Anthony arrested and sent north into imprisonment. Richard arrives in London with his nephew, Edward V. Edward is eventually installed at the Tower, which is not unusual. This is where monarchs go to prepare for their coronation. And they talked about putting him in a couple of other places, and I think the decision seems to be, why move him around several times? Let's just put him where he needs to be in the end anyway. During the rest of the journey south, Elizabeth Woodville, Edward IV's widow, has taken her other son by Edward IV, Richard Duke of York, another Richard Duke of York, just what this story needs, and all of her daughters into sanctuary in Westminster, I think because the coup that they have tried to undertake has failed, and she realises that leaves her vulnerable and exposed, and so she runs into sanctuary. In the middle of June, we get a few days in which everything seems to change. So Richard Duke of York is allowed out of sanctuary. The Archbishop of Canterbury goes to visit Elizabeth Woodville. The Duke of York comes out of sanctuary to join his brother in the Tower on the basis that he's going to attend the coronation. But over the course of the next few days, we see a council meeting at which Lord Hastings is executed summarily, supposedly on a charge of treason, but we don't know exactly what that was actually all about. And then this story emerges that Edward IV had married bigamously, and therefore his union with Elizabeth Woodville is illegal. All of the children from that marriage are illegitimate, and illegitimacy is an absolute bar to the throne. Therefore they can't become king. They're removed from the line of succession. Edward V can no longer be king. And there's another alternative. So the brother between Edward and Richard, George, has a son. George is dead by this point. George has a son, the Earl of Warwick, but he is specifically barred by his father's attainder for treason from succession. And so this delegation from London visit Richard at Baynard Castle and ask him to become the next King of England. So that's the legal technical shortcut reason. The question is, what is going on at the various points when a decision's being made, and why are they being made? And that's the bit that's really difficult for us to get at.
And to be clear, when you say it emerges or someone claims that Edward IV was married bigamously to Elizabeth Woodville, that's actually, I think, was it the Archbishop of Canterbury has said?
No, it's Well, we get one source. Philippe de Camille on the Continent is the only source that gives us a name, and he says it's a man named Robert Stillington, who is the Bishop of Bath and Wells, who breaks this story.
So it could be someone who's behaving under political pressure. But is it your sense that the pre-contract, which is to say the previous marriage, which renders the later marriage bigamous, do you believe that's the case? Is that your position, Matt?
I think there's more possibility of it being real than most people allow for, in that I think the question is, can Edward IV be believed to have married in secret to get a woman into bed? Well, yes, he can, because that's exactly how he becomes married to Elizabeth Woodville. The only question is, does he do that twice? And it appears to me that in 1483 in London, it was believable enough to people who had been around Edward that he might have done that they were willing to accept whatever evidence is produced. We're told evidence is produced and it's believed. And I think it's really difficult for us to sit here and say it definitely isn't true when people in 1483 saw evidence and believed that it probably was true.
Ken Hillier, so when do you think that Richard decided or realised he had to become king?
I think the elephant in the room is the Duke of Buckingham, actually. He hated the Woodvilles. He hated his marriage, apparently. I mean, we don't know what happened, but I think you've got Buckingham in his ear all the time. Hastings is getting more and more angry. Hastings is a fascinating character. I've got a lot of partiality for Hastings, but something goes wrong. The hatred for the Woodvilles, which both Buckingham and Hastings apparently show, it isn't enough for Hastings to go full on with Richard and yeah, okay, you can become king. So I really don't know. We're talking about a matter of not of weeks now. We're talking a matter of days, aren't we?
Yeah.
And something happened that made Richard, who, you imagine Richard, again, we go back to this imagination. Richard comes, he's been boss of the North for years, highly successful. And he comes down, if we assume, yes, that he was made protector, he's Constable of England as well, and he comes down and he finds an absolute mess in London. And the Woodvilles, clearly, this is where I go along with Annie's version of Elizabeth Woodville. You didn't like her, nor do I. And Richard's got to act fast, and you've got Buckingham in his ear. You've got to do this, mate. And I thought we were going to talk about usurpation, and I think if you go and read Matt's book on usurpation, he's spot on. It really wasn't any more usurpation than we go back to about 5 or 6 monarchs before, and this one is the least usurper of all of them. Buckingham, I think, is key to what goes on.
Okay, brilliant. Annie, at what point do you think Richard decides that he needs to be king, or he wants to be, but likely just needs to be?
I think the seeds of Richard's downfall are set so much earlier, by the whole volatility of Edward's reign, and by his failure to, Edward IV ultimately failed as a king because he did not secure his dynasty, he did not secure his succession. This foolish marriage with Eleanor Talbot, and Richard reaped the whirlwind. And I think when he, if you think of him psychologically, what he's facing, a man who has always felt throughout his life a need to build his own security and safety, a man who has achieved that in the north of England, he finds himself in London in the middle of complete and utter chaos. Complete chaos. And it must have seemed there was nowhere to turn. Hastings, the Woodvilles, all of that, the French threatening to invade, the country in uproar. He must have thought, I've kind of got to do this. And, everyone puts a lot of pressure on Robert Stillington as being the man who spilled the beans. But the whole time I was researching for the book, I just kept coming back to Cecily and thinking, if anyone knew about the previous marriage with Eleanor Talbot, it was the women in their lives. Yeah. And Cecily was related to the family of Eleanor Talbot. At some point, someone was going to go to Cecily and say, do you know what your Edward is up to with our Eleanor? And in 1460, when it was happening, it would have been in Cecily's interest to sweep it under the carpet and make it go away. In 1483, it was very much in everyone's interest for her to lift that carpet up and sweep it back out again.
It just reminds me of what Harold Macmillan is meant to have said about the greatest challenge towards somebody in power. Events, dear boy, events. And that's surely what takes over Richard. It's events.
Well, let's move on to his reign, because that is a reign driven by events, is it not? So Richard reigns for 26 months, and we want to try and keep this under the hour. So Matt, could you give us a 2-minute summary on the kind of achievements of Richard's reign as we could see them from 5 centuries on?
No, you meanie, I can't. I think he significantly puts down an early rebellion. So October 1483, we have Buckingham's rebellion. This, it's affected by, we're told, the weather coming out of Wales and all kinds of things. And for all we've talked about Richard's view of himself in the world, he's now become an anointed king. God has chosen him to sit there. This is the ultimate realisation of everything he might have hoped for the recognition for himself. He's managed to put down a rebellion successfully. This makes him look, new kings aren't averse to rebellions. It's a fairly common thing. He's put that down really successfully. His parliament sits in January and into February 1484 and has been remarked on ever since for some of the laws that it passed. It extends the concern that we've seen him show for the common man in his time in the north of England. He introduces reform of the bail system and the jury systems and the weights and measures systems that are meant to make the world a fairer place around him. And my question is, I guess, if he's benefiting a certain group of society, who is he afflicting with these laws? Who is he drawing power from to pass it away? Well, he's drawing power from anyone who is significant enough to keep him on the throne. And throughout his reign, then, we see people begin to drift off onto the continent, and a faux court emerge around this figure, Henry Tudor, who is a distantly Lancastrian heir. He's been in exile for most of his life. He's sort of the last figure that opposition to Yorkist kings have to cling to. Henry Tudor seems to make this arrangement through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, that he will marry Edward IV's oldest daughter, Elizabeth of York, if he manages to invade England and depose Richard. So you get this coalition beginning to form against Richard, and he doesn't seem able to diffuse that or to play that down sufficiently, so that by the time we get to August 1485, there is an army arriving from France. And I think, again, significant Richard's relationship with France here. We go back to Picquigny, where he's the one that won't be bought off. He's the one that wants to fight. He wants a war with the French. And in 1485, the French have got their own minority crisis. Louis XI has died. Charles VIII is a 13-year-old boy. They have a civil war that erupts immediately after this. Why are the French backing an invasion of England? Because they're probably slightly scared of Richard. These are all elements that people often overlook in what's going on. But this army invades. I don't think the French expected that army to succeed. I don't think maybe Henry Tudor had more than a vague, fingers crossed hope that it might succeed. I think the French were just hoping to keep Richard busy till the end of campaigning season 1485. And it's interesting that Richard chooses this cavalry charge tactic at Bosworth, because I think with them playing back into this idea of chivalry, maybe he's thinking about that time he spent on Agincourt battlefield. What's a tactic that an English army isn't used to fighting against anymore? They're actually not used to fighting against cavalry charges anymore. English armies haven't used that against English armies for centuries by this point. So there is some sense in what he does, but it all goes wrong mainly because there's French people on the field who do know how to defend against a cavalry charge. So I think his reign is a story of lots of things that we might today recognise as promising and good, but he fails to deliver those in a way that is acceptable to late medieval English society. He's then unable to pick apart this coalition that develops around the idea of deposing him, and ultimately loses a battle that he, on paper at least, should have won.
Brilliant. That's very comprehensive. Thank you very much, Matt. Annie, what does his reign and also his modes of death at Bosworth, valiantly fighting at the heart of the scrum, what does that tell you about this man that you've written rather a lot about?
I can't help but feel that Richard of Bosworth was a man who was trying to prove something to himself. And I do think it comes back to his religiosity and the point that Ken was making earlier about this piety combined with rationalism. I think the cavalry charge was a huge toss of the dice, and if if God was on his side, then he would triumph.
Mm. And how close did he come? I mean, Matt, what's your view? How close? We can't know. What do you think?
I mean, he's literally within a sword's length of Henry Tudor. You know, he kills Henry Tudor's standard bearer, the man whose job it is to stand next to Henry Tudor. I think he was within a whisker of that cavalry charge working, of killing Henry Tudor and immediately therefore ending the battle and the last resistance to his reign. So it all turns on that brief moment when those two must have locked eyes within a sword's length of each other across the battlefield, and Richard must have thought, right, this is it, now I'm going to end this. And then we get the kind of the Stanley sweep in and wipe that away from him. But I think it was that close. I think we were within minutes of Richard winning Bosworth.
It has to be one of the most dramatic moments in English history, doesn't it? It's just so incredibly dramatic.
It also seems quite unfair, really, but because... Okay, so Ken, you've alluded to this earlier on. There's an interesting point about the way that Bosworth defines Richard, and we look at him as if he's on an escalator to Bosworth throughout the whole of his life. How do we disentangle Bosworth from the rest of his life?
Well, I think by doing what we've done today, and by reading the sensible biographies, I won't name names, and novelists, but to me, I think one point we've missed was the fact that who was chosen to be in charge of the reinterment of the Duke of York. It was Richard, who brought him to Fotheringhay. He played the major part in it. Who was the person who in 1480 Edward IV wrote to the Pope about a loving brother? Throughout Edward IV's reign and the boy growing up into a young man, you have this dedicated, loyal person, probably pious, probably happily married. And one of the questions you suggested we might look at, we've probably not got time now, is what would have happened if he'd won? I think the most interesting point for me is if we believe some of the research which has gone on in the last 5 years, how would he have brought the princes back into society? Would they have been made important dukes or whatever? Would he have been married? And what about his own marriage? And when I went to university and so on, the big thing was it a new monarchy, Henry VII? And they were pushing it back. No, we've got just as much new monarchy in Edward IV's reign. Yeah. So another question for me would be, would Richard III be called a new monarch in the 1490s and the 1500s? It's impossible to answer, but that doesn't stop you asking questions, does it?
Two last questions then to Matt and Annie, and then finally you, Ken. In a sentence or two, how do you sum up this very mysterious figure from our past? I'll start with you, Matt, since it's a tough question.
It is, but I think this is a man who reigned for 26 months, but has a historical society that's just turned 100 years old dedicated to him in the Richard III Society. That tells you that he is an endlessly fascinating, deeply complex figure, but his story is contested. It polarises opinion even 500 years after the events, almost like it really still matters today to a lot of people on both sides of the argument. And so I think he is someone who is complicated, difficult to get to know, but there are so many facets of his story that often get overlooked that when you start to explore them, really fill out the character of the man and help to explain some of those things that go on later in his life too. As Ken said, we shouldn't start at the end and work our way back. We need to start at the beginning and work our way forwards without the benefit of hindsight and without the sense of inevitability.
Annie, do you have anything to add on, to define on who this man is?
I think that's the one thing I always say to people who perhaps come to Richard III first through my novels is and don't recognise the Shakespearean tyrant, is forget those few weeks in the summer of 1483. Just put them outside of your head for a minute and then look at the man's 30 years of life that came before then, because they are so much more interesting and so much more revealing. None of us, when we're under intense pressure, none of us act within our character, do we? You know, we're pushed to extremes. and Richard III in the summer of 1483 was pushed to extremes. So to get a real measure of the man, we have to look at how he behaved. I think my overall impression of Richard in the end was here was a man who wanted stability, security, fair dealing for himself, but for the society and the community around him as well. And I think the desire for that was born out of the massive period of insecurity that was his childhood, that characterized his growing up. How he must have longed just to be able to stand on some stable ground for a while. And in 1483, all of that stable ground is just pulled from under him.
Yeah. Brilliant, thank you. Now, Ken, last word to you. How should Richard III be remembered?
Well, I'd start with the motto, loyalty may lier. I think he was an intensely loyal, dedicated man, not only to his brother, but to the kingdom, and in more particularly to the north. That takes a very uneven half, doesn't it, up to 1483. Now, what Annie's just said, you can't argue with. Those months, and then stretching out to just under 2 years, it showed that he's a man of his time. He had to be, he was ambitious, yes, of course he was, but he had to be ruthless finally, and essentially, he failed at the end. He died in battle. And the 2 years, although they're very good points, Matt mentioned the point about the Parliament, and some good stuff there, but he was killed at Bosworth, and his reign, not his life, his reign, unfortunately, has to be seen as a failure.
Well, we're still talking about it 500 years later, and
I would not describe it as a failure, but an unfulfilled promise.
Yes, that's better.
Yeah, that's better. Okay, Matt, you agree with me on unfulfilled promise?
Yeah, I'd go along with that. I think in strict dynastic terms, as a medieval king, you can view it as a failure, but I think the interesting thing is, why does he fail? And I think it goes back to lots of his policies and his concerns.
Brilliant. Thank you, all of you. Right, well, listeners, I hope you've enjoyed this lively discussion in this special edition. The Ricardian Podcast is brought to you by the Richard III Society. If you'd like to find out more about the life and times of Richard III and you aren't already a member of the Richard III Society, then please take a look at our website, which is at richardthird.net, which is Richard followed by 3 I's and then the .net. There's lots more information there about Richard and his world, plus everything you need to know about membership and becoming a member and member benefits. All that leaves me to do is to say a massive thank you to our 3 wonderful guests in this episode, Matt Lewis, Annie Garthwaite and Kenneth Hillier. Thank you guys, you've been amazing. I hope that wasn't too arduous. Thank you. Thank you to our listeners for listening too. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please do rate it, leave a comment, share it and pass it on. Spread the word. Until next time then, from all of us, thank you and goodbye.